good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as we now are accustomed to say. Hello all, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Shamsia Ali. I'm a Special Advisor at Healthy Brains Global Initiative, responsible for business development and fundraising. And I'll be facilitating today's session. It's so lovely to have you all join us. We are expecting a few more people. We've had a really good response to this session in terms of registration. So please excuse people as they join in. So this is the first of a series of capacity building sessions that we are hosting in partnership with a range of partners on outcomes contracting. So this is session 1 of 5, which we will be delivering remotely over the next 6 or so months over this calendar year. And each one will be free to attend. So please do keep joining us. For those of you that have joined us new, and just a bit of background. So we launched a report in May titled Paying for Outcomes on Mental Health Programs. The report really summarises the responses to a call for expression of interest we ran last summer, as a way of engaging with the service provider market in the mental health sector, mental health space, to understand what programs were being delivered, what services were being delivered, and understand service providers' interest in outcomes contracting. How were they interested in being contracted for those services on outcomes, and understanding what programs are out there that could be amenable to being paid on outcomes, as opposed to the traditional fee for service. So our report summarises the 51 responses we received to that call. And part of our kind of legacy and onward work from that report is this series of workshops, capacity building workshops that we're running, introducing outcomes-based contracting to the service providers and to this space, as we appreciate that it is new for many. If you're not familiar with the report, we will put a link to the report on the chat. Do have a look on that, have a look at the report, some fascinating programs there to be seen. Also, for those of you that are not familiar with Healthy Brains Global Initiative, the report does give an overview of who we are. But just for the interest of those that are on this call, we were established back in 2020, with the support of WHO, UNICEF and the World Bank, and largely with initial support, financial support from the Wellcome Trust and some pharmaceuticals, including Johnson & Johnson and Otsuka. We're here to address the lack and deficit in the global understanding of the causes and consequences of poor mental health, and understanding particularly research which tends to come from sort of the Western, Northern, white hemisphere. And we're really doing this kind of by focusing on service provision and sort of the delivery. So we're bringing a new way of contracting mental health services and mental health programs, focusing on linking payments to the delivery of actual real world outcomes for those service users, a focus on outcomes. And this is what this session is about. And Richard will speak about this in a bit. So we are in essence an outcomes funder. We raise funds from donors and funders, and we manage those funds, whether they're thematic or regionally focused. And then we use those funds to contract and manage a series of programs. And as I say, paying on the results, paying on the outcomes. We also support fund holders, such as governments, in designing and mobilising outcomes-based contracts. So today is an introduction to outcomes contracting, what it is, how does it differ from traditional fee for program services, and the advantages and disadvantages of the different ways of funding, and particularly focusing on outcomes contracting. You will hear firstly from Richard Johnson, the CEO of HBGI. Richard, you have your camera on and waving. Perfect. Richard is the CEO, as I said. He's had over 2 decades of working in the field of social inclusion, including health and employment. Mental health has been a running theme in Richard's career, as has outcomes-based contracting or results-based financing, or the other terms that we use for this. I hope it doesn't embarrass you, Richard, when I say that you are probably one of the world's experts on this funding approach. So great to have you here. Previous to becoming the CEO of Healthy Brains Global Initiative, Richard was a senior advisor at the Global Fund for a couple of years and a senior consultant for the World Bank, where Richard spent 4 years in Afghanistan advising the Ministry of Health there on contracting health services, so linking payments to health outcomes and health interventions. As well as being our CEO, Richard is still involved in a number of impact bonds, chairing, for example, a development impact bond in Palestine that's looking at youth employment, and a similar impact bond around employment programs in South Africa, where Richard is advising the government there. And he has been a chair of a number of impact bonds in the past, in sort of many in the UK, spanning a number of sectors from housing and refugee integration to employment and mental health. I want to take the opportunity to also introduce you to other HBGI colleagues that might be on the call. Roxanne. Roxanne joins us from McKinsey's on a 6-month fellowship, and we're really delighted to have Roxanne here with us, and she works with us across all of our projects. And Roxanne will be managing all the slide decks today, so thank you, Roxanne. We will also be joined, if they're not already on the call, some members of our Lived Experience Council. So our Lived Experience Council are really crucial to ensuring that everything we say and do at HBGI has the lived experience voice integrated and shapes what we do and going forward. As they come on, they can wave and say hello. We will run this session in partnership with Village Enterprise. Village Enterprise do feature in our report Paying for Outcomes and Mental Health Programmes. We highlight their programme, and it's a fascinating programme, so please do have a look at it, though you will hear about it today. Village Enterprise colleagues will be providing the service provider perspective from their development impact bond. It is a fascinating model. They will talk about impact bond, as will Richard. Just a word on impact bond. There will be a future session, one of these capacity building sessions, where we talk about capital and cash flow for outcomes-based contracting. So we will talk about impact bonds there. So if it all seems a bit too much, bear with us. I will take a moment just to quickly introduce Tadeo Muriki on the call. Tadeo, hello, thank you so much for being with us. Tadeo will talk about the Village Enterprise model in a little bit. He's the Chief Government Relations Officer for Village Enterprise. And previous to that, he was the Kenya Country Director for 6 years. And was the Village Enterprise Development Impact Bond Project Manager. And so you will hear from Tadeo about this in a little while. And we're also joined by Celeste Brubaker, the Chief Impact Officer. Great to have you join us, Celeste. So before I hand over to Richard to get us going, just some really quick housekeeping. We have got 2 sessions today. It is a repeat. You do not have to join both sessions. We are recording the sessions, including this one. We'll make the recording and the slides that we will be sharing today available after the conclusion of both sessions. We will email it out to you, and we'll also upload it onto our website. We ask that you're on mute, but we really want to hear from you. We've built in sessions within today's presentation for your comments and questions, but please do also keep asking them on the chat group, and we'll monitor them. And I think that might be it. The beauty of a virtual workshop is I don't need to tell you where the bathrooms are. So Richard, over to you, and then Roxanne, if you can bring up the slides.
Thank you, Shamsia. Thank you for the lengthy introduction to me. So as Shamsia says, we will be looking at outcomes contracting today, and then the second part of the session will be with Village Enterprise to look at an application of an outcomes contract, specifically an impact bond that they rather wonderfully delivered in Africa. I am not an academic. I am a practitioner. For the last 23 years, as Shamsia says, I have been working in outcomes contracting as a service provider, as a service designer, as a contract designer and a performance manager. And I find the best way to understand different contracting models is generally as an evolution. in comparison with each other and as a journey of learning for me personally and my personal narrative in relation to these contracts, but also as I think I have seen them evolve in the way that they've been applied by different contracting bodies, different commissioners over the years. I am still learning, but today I will walk you through where I think this brings us and the relative advantages and disadvantages of these models. We have 145 people registered across these two sessions. We've just got 21 so far with us this morning. So I'll try and make this as interactive as possible. If you have thoughts and comments, please put them in the chat room. I can see the chat room, and I'll try and make sure that we have a discussion as we go through, but generally try and whip through the stuff that I wanted to cover, and then we'll have some time, a little bit longer time for questions and answers before we hand over to Village Enterprise. In the session today, those 20 people that we have, you represent some remarkable organizations and a remarkable variety of services. So I do hope that we get to hear from you. In talking about contracting, it's useful that we agree the same vocabulary, the same language that we're going to use to describe it. I first really was exposed to the results chain when I started doing work with the World Bank about 10 years ago. And they will typically use this to describe programs that they implement, that they design, that they contract. And it's probably not a long way away from the notion of a theory of change. But essentially, we've got the inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impact of a program. Next slide, please, Roxanne. Possibly easiest to think about this, for me anyway, and again, this is part of my personal narrative, in terms of employment programs. So if we have an unemployed person and we're deploying some sort of program or service to help that person into a job, what does that look like in terms of the results chain? The input into that program might be training that's being delivered. An output would be the completion of that training. Maybe they get a certificate of some sort. The outcome is them actually getting a job and keeping that job. And then our impact is an increase in rates of employment or reduction in unemployment. So please bear these four in mind as we go through. Contracting generally connects the money to one or more of these. Okay, thank you, Roxanne. So my story here really begins in 1999. There'd been a general election in the UK and Labour had won the election with Tony Blair. And at that point in the UK, there was rampant youth unemployment. There were 1 million unemployed young people, 18 to 24-year-olds. And there was also a high level of intransigent long-term unemployment amongst older people who had been unemployed for 12, 18 months. And this was seen as a big social issue, and the Labour government committed to address it. They rolled out a whole bunch of programs through the Public Employment Service, a very large service in the UK at that time, but they also wanted to see how the private sector could deliver. And I was employed to come in to an area of northwest London called Brent to implement something called an employment zone, where we as a private sector organisation were going to be paid on the basis of results, on whether we could actually work with long-term unemployed people and link them with employment and keep them in those jobs. This is a picture of Wembley High Street. Could I have the next slide, please? At this point in employment services in the UK, the typical contracting model was a fee-for-service model. This in itself was quite a step forward from the sort of typical contracting that you often see, where a government simply hands out money, reimburses a budget, possibly gives a grant. Moving on from that, we have a fee-for-service, where the government, the commissioner, in this case, the Department for Employment, they decide what program that they think is the response that is needed, and they determine what that service looks like in terms of a number of steps, and they attach a payment to each of those steps. So in addressing unemployment, they decide that people need to be upskilled. So they introduce a skills training program, and they pay the service provider for each person that they enroll on their program, for each person that stays on that program, and each person that completes the program. So they're attaching a fee to the service in terms of inputs and outputs. Service provider provides evidence of these people on the program, and that's what they get paid for. The next slide, please. A Advantages to this is, the commissioners, the people who are paying for these programs, they really like it. It puts them in a position of control. They're the people who know what is needed. They determine the design of the program and they hand it out to the service providers. They can make sure that everybody receives exactly the same service so that no one is missed out. It's an equal service for everybody. The providers like this model because they're given a regular supply of money. They sign people up for the program, they deliver it, they keep receiving their money. There's no problem with cash flow. It's quite easy to decide how much this is going to cost because we can look at all the different moving parts so the government can decide quite accurately how much to pay for this program, for these services that they're paying for. And generally speaking, in procurement terms, this is the sweet spot for our governments or our other funders. This is what they know how to do. But there are disadvantages to it. Next slide, please, Roxanne. If we're training someone, we're not necessarily getting them into a job. If we train a bunch of nurses in how to wash their hands, we don't necessarily increase the hygiene back in the health facility. We're not necessarily attaching our money to the success that we're actually looking to pay for. We've moved away, in fact, from our definition of success, from the outcome that we're looking to achieve. There's a bunch of risks for the commissioner in this. They have to carry the volume risk. So if people are not enrolled on the program, they're still going to pay the service provider, maybe. If they don't achieve the outcomes, if people don't find jobs, if the health facilities are not improved in terms of their capacity, then the commissioner fails. I don't think it's necessarily value for money. I've seen a lot of programs around the world where tens of thousands of people are trained, but nobody gets a job at the end of it. That's not value for money, even if the training was cheap. And it emphasizes a process. This is take people on and put everybody through the same process. All of the service recipients are going to go through the same thing. One size will fit all of them. And it determines then the culture of the service. The culture of what is delivered is determined by how it's contracted and how it's paid for. In this instance, it becomes a machine. It becomes a process and a bureaucracy in which you count people along that process. And it's hardly going to be innovative. The next slide, please. It is the model that you would generally see the World Bank use and the Global Fund to an extent. So the World Bank typically, of course, will act as the lender to a government. They agree with the government what it is that they should be delivering, a training program. The government then contract a service provider to run that training program, and they pay that training provider on the basis of the activities, the hiring of the venue, the hiring of the staff, and the inputs in terms of the training that they deliver, and maybe the outputs in terms of someone completing the training. They provide evidence of this, the service provider to the government, and they get paid, and the government gets paid by the World Bank. Global Fund have stepped even further away from this in that effectively they reimburse governments for this. So they agree a plan with the government goes off and delivers against that plan. And when they produce the receipts for having spent the money, then they're reimbursed by the Global Fund. And the Global Fund will audit that. So we've got with the World Bank this focus on inputs. Sometimes they have a little performance bonus for an outcome at the end of it. It might be an additional 10, 20% bonus that someone can earn, but it doesn't really change cultures. It doesn't really change behaviors. In the Global Fund, they start to view success in terms of whether the money was spent, because that's what they're tracking. That is what success has become. Is the money absorbed? Is it dispersed? Next slide, please. So let's go back to Brent. This is me, 1999, 2000. I've got to implement a program here in which long-term unemployed people are sent to me or to the case managers that I employ, and I will be paid if and only if I can get those people into jobs. I've got an outcome-based contract. Next slide, please. And I learned pretty much all I'm ever going to learn about this sort of a program from someone called Bernard. Now, Bernard was one of the long-term unemployed people who was sent to see us. And I think you should actually try and imagine yourselves now as case managers on this employment program. So Bernard has been sent to see you, and your job is to help him find employment. Now, Bernard is 52 years old. He's been unemployed for at least 5 years. He's got a very low level of basic skills, very poor literacy, poor numeracy. He can't really read or write. Until 5 years ago, he worked on building sites in basic laboring type jobs, but he just doesn't feel physically fit enough to continue in that environment. He lives alone in a bedsit. He has no family. He has no social network, no real friends around him. And he has, as you might understand, become depressed. He is wearing dirty, greasy, smelly clothes. He's got long, greasy gray hair and a great big sore on the side of his mouth. This is a real story. And Bernard comes to see you and he says, look, can you help me find a job? Any job, I'll take it. The only thing is, Bernard will only take the job if Sheba can go with him. Sheba is his 12-year-old mongrel dog. Not sure that's a photograph of a mongrel, but Sheba was a black and white mongrel dog. Now, Bernard, fortunately, was paired with a case manager that I employed who had been working with unemployed people for a number of years in the Public Employment Service and joined our program because she wanted to have the handcuffs removed. She wanted to be able to work with the individuals that were sent to her, not with a fixed process. But we turned this Bernard question into an interview question. And for the following 10 years, as I ran organizations delivering these services, we would ask potential case managers, what would you do if Bernard was your job seeker? How are you going to help him? And it was hugely illuminating in terms of the responses that we would get. If someone came to us from a training background, they would hear the description of Bernard and they would only hear poor literacy and numeracy. And their response would be, I've got to train Bernard, I've got to teach him to read and write before I can find him a job. If the potential case manager had come from a psychological background, a counseling background, they would hear the fact that he was depressed. And they would say, oh, I've got to provide him with counseling. I've got to address his mental well-being before I can find him a job. If this would-be case manager came from the Public Employment Service, they would often say, but Bernard is imposing an unreasonable restriction on his job seeking. He's breaking the rules. The rules of the bureaucracy state he has to take a job. A dog can't stop him taking that job. And in one instance, I had an interviewee tell me that we had to put the dog down in order to help Bernard find a job. The place that people came from, the processes that they sat within, which had been shaped by the way those systems were paid for and then managed by those cultures, determined their response to Bernard and to Sheba. But ours was a new program. In ours, we were paid to get Bernard a job and keep him in that job. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is an outcomes contract. We have a commissioner here, again, the Department for Employment. They agree that success on this program is someone who starts a job, and in the case of this employment zone, is still in the job 13 weeks later. That's what they're going to pay us for. Our job is to engage with all of the Bernards in the area, help them find jobs, and we will be paid only if we achieve that outcome. What might be the advantages or the disadvantages of this program? So here, and really, and you'll see this in the academic papers on this, contracting is about the alignment of incentives. And here, we're very closely aligning the incentives of the commissioner, which is more people into jobs, with the incentive of the service provider, us, get people into jobs, because that's how we'll be paid, and the service beneficiaries themselves who want to find jobs. It shifts the culture. It shifts the way we talk about things. It shifts the emphasis that we give to everything. And because we've got to get as many people as possible into these jobs, the only way we're going to be able to do it is through building a really positive relationship with these unemployed people. We have to deliver a quality program as well as a quantity program in order to achieve our outcomes. This, for me, is real value for money. This is paying for what you want to get. This is paying for the success that you're really looking to achieve. The risk sits with us, the service providers, of course, and the volume risk is ours. We've got to go out and find these people. When we get into the international development space, we see that donors, the Foreign Commonwealth Office, USAID, get tired of Well, their citizens get tired of throwing money at what they think are failing programs. Here they can see exactly where their money goes. It has the potential to reduce fraud on programs because you simply pay for the results. And this program will focus on individuals. It will be highly personalized. It will innovate and flex. When we introduced performance-based contracts in Afghanistan, we gave the service providers, the health providers, the freedom to go and negotiate with the local warlord, the local Taliban controller, in order to change their service to the local circumstances to deliver a more localized response that enabled them to deliver a better service to the health users there. And because you are constantly now tracking who is coming on the program, what am I doing with them? Am I progressing them in order to achieve my outcome? You create a much more data-rich environment. These programs generate a lot more data that gives us a lot more insight into what is going on and provides a lot more learning to improve services. There are disadvantages, of course. Roxanne. The commissioner may not carry the financial risk of this, but if the program doesn't work, there's a social risk for them. We need some money to run this, because if you're only going to pay me for outcomes, I've got to get the money, the cash to run my program ahead of my outcome payments from somewhere. If I borrow it from a bank, then that's going to add a cost to the program. Maybe this makes this whole thing more attractive to big organizations who have got the ability to borrow the money or have got the money in the bank that they can use. A small NGO invariably won't have that ability. It's often said that this potentially incentivizes contractors to cherry pick, to find the easy people. They're going to be paid for outcomes, so they'll go and find those people who are easiest to help. Now, we can address this through design of our contract and the way we target the program, but it's one of the criticisms that's made against it. It is a new way of delivering, and in order for it to work, there will have to be a change in the capacity and in the culture of both the service provider and the commissioner, the contracting body. Can I have the next slide, please? But it does work. These employment zones in the UK back in 2000 worked spectacularly successfully. And over a number of years following that, there were subsequent contracts in the UK targeting unemployment in this way, and again in Australia. And the area we've seen the biggest growth in outcomes contracting is in employment programs, partly because the outcome itself is so clear and easy to define. And we'll come on to that in just a moment. Here was a study that was done of these programs in 2003, and this was actually comparing the percentage of the people that you got into work with the size of the caseload for each of your case managers. So a case manager is given a number of unemployed people to work with at any one time. That's their caseload. If I give them a small caseload, they get more of the people they're working with into work. Surprise, surprise. Small caseload means they can see people more often, they can engage with them more, they do more with them, they get more of them into work. So I introduced these programs 2000, 2002 with one organization, then I went on to another one, 2002 to 2006. And we did incredibly well. We could get, roughly speaking, wherever we opened one of our offices, about 50% of the unemployed people who were sent to us into jobs. Can I have the next slide, please? But then this was my challenge. If I want to keep getting more and more people into work, how do I get from 50% into work to 51%? What would make the difference then in my service? I made the caseloads as small as I possibly could. I pushed them down to 35 unemployed people per case manager. I introduced additional service providers that my case managers could refer difficult job seekers to. I put a psychologist in the office that they could refer their job seekers to. And I couldn't move beyond 50%. They could get 50% into jobs. And if I introduced an additional service provider, they would send number 47, 48, and 49 to that service provider because they were difficult and wouldn't work with them themselves. I just couldn't get outside of this 50% success rate. So I engaged with the government at that point, and we decided to try and implement a new model. Can I have the next slide, please? And in this, I created the role of a prime contractor. So here, the commissioner, the contracting body, contracted with me and paid me if I achieved the outcomes, in this case, again, getting people into jobs. I didn't actually deliver any of the service myself. I didn't employ any case managers. I stepped back from the service and I subcontracted to a network of local organizations, each of whom delivered a piece of the program. In stepping back then, I was able to try to judge which service provider was best at which piece of the program. I could move my job seekers through these service providers according to their needs. I could try and connect the money that I was spending more directly with the needs of the individuals because I had a cleaner relationship with their journey through the program. My service providers delivered the program, they got people into jobs, I then claimed it back from the government. And my service providers, in some cases, decided that they wanted a risk share, so they also wanted to be paid for outcomes, and in other cases, they wanted a fee-for-service payment model. But wrapped around it was my outcome-based prime contractor. Can I have the next slide, please? So we've got this contract management wrapped around it, this performance management, which is really focused on delivering performance and delivering outcomes. This is driving then the culture within that whole system. I can localize that service. I can cut across the typical silos of thinking like we found with Bernard. We've got this separation of duties between the commissioner, who simply decide what the outcome is and what they're going to pay for, and then this prime contractor who is doing the direct performance management of it, and the service providers themselves engaged with the service users. Potentially, it gives the commissioner the ability to move to bigger, longer, larger contracts over time. Can I have the next slide, please? Maybe it's more expensive, this model, because I, as the prime contractor, have some transaction costs that need to be covered. I maybe want to add a margin to my costs, and my service providers do. So maybe we have margin on margin. In some cases, new prime contractors that decided also to deliver this model wanted to provide some of the service themselves. And I think there we had a conflict of interest. Potentially, the prime contractor could require its service providers also to have an outcomes contract. And then they're going to be passing more of the risk down to the front, possibly to small NGOs who can't manage that upfront borrowing, who don't have the sort of cash to work in that way. And maybe this encourages governments to work with a smaller number of larger organizations doing this, which means we end up with a homogenized, common, less innovative service. But again, I think the advantages here outweigh the disadvantages. Could we move on, please? In these outcome contracts, what is it that makes a good outcome? What is really going to drive these behaviors? Can I have the next slide, please? And again, a contract is all about behavior driving. It's really about reinforcing the behavior within that service. How do we maximize the strength of that reinforcement? By, I think, attaching the money to the outcome. We want to push the money as far as possible down that results chain. In the village enterprise example you're going to hear shortly, the money was actually pushed all the way to the impact. Now, their program delivered huge success, but I think they pushed the money too far down the chain. I think we need to keep the money close enough to delivery so that it actually drives the management thinking within that service. So I like to attach it as far as possible to the outcome. We've got to keep this clean. We've got to keep it clear. We've got to make sure it's understandable. And these payments have got to be attached to a small number. In Afghanistan, we had 11 payment triggers. That was quite a lot. I think an optimal number might be about 6 or 7. On an outcomes contract that I had recently in West Yorkshire, an impact bond in England, there were 20 or 30 payment triggers. Far too many for people to think about. And again, we're trying to get inside the culture, in the thinking, in the language of this service. What is it that's going to drive that? What is an optimum number of key performance indicators? We want our outcomes to be relevant, have face validity, to seem relevant to the program and to the people who are accessing the program. We've got to be able to measure them, of course, and we need to be able to verify them in some way. If we're going to pay for them, we need to know that they've actually happened. And we need then to cost them taking into consideration the cost to the service providers. I have seen so many poor contracts around the world where price competition has been used as the sole determinant or the principal determinant of who gets the contract. And in using price competition, they forget that actually it costs money to employ staff, to open premises, to engage with service providers. And if I try to do it on the cheap, I'll be delivering a cheap service that doesn't deliver success. And then once this program is up and running, we've got to track it. We've got to capture our data. We need that data reported. When I was the prime contractor, my service providers reported on a weekly basis, and all of those reports were made public. And on a monthly basis, we had a formal review process with each one of them, where we looked at what have they been doing over the previous month and what were they going to do in the next coming month to improve that delivery. Next slide, please. Quickly then on impact bonds, before we pause for questions and then pass on to Village Enterprise. The next slide. So I've talked about this, the prime contractor model. We've got the commissioner saying, okay, I'm going to pay you for these outcomes. Prime contractor going, okay, I will take on this risk and I will subcontract to a group of service providers. Those service providers will deliver the program, the frontline service to the beneficiaries. They'll achieve the outcomes for me. They'll give me the evidence. I'll submit it to the commissioner and I'll get paid. But where does the capital come from for this? The working capital, the cash for it. Prime contractor, big, rich private sector organization, maybe they've got the cash to do it. Does the service provider have the cash? There are a number of places we could go for this. Can I have the next slide? It could be a provider who's got the cash in the bank already, or they could go and borrow it from somewhere. Or we could try and remove this working capital requirement by bringing some of our payments forward. So not all of it will be attached to outcomes. We could pay for some inputs as well. On the impact bond that I have in Palestine, we're paid some money for enrolling people, some money for completing training with them, some money for completing an internship with them. Though most of our money is attached to the outcome of employment, it means some of the money is trickled into the system. It's possible, and this is what we were doing on an outcomes contract in Ethiopia with the World Bank. We were going to pay a mobilization allowance to the service providers. So they'd be paid for the outcomes, but we would effectively lend them some money at the beginning. They would use that money to start the program delivering and then pay it back once they achieved the outcomes that they were contracted for. Or we can bring in what they call social investors. And these social investors will provide the capital. And this is what a social or development impact bond is. These things are viewed as incredibly complicated, and they're not. It's simply a way to address the cash requirement. So we have a structure that looks very like the prime contractor model, with the commissioner contracting with the investors then subcontract with the service providers who engage with the beneficiaries. In Palestine, my commissioner is the World Bank through the Palestinian Authority. They contract with a special purpose vehicle, a company that 4 investors have set up in Palestine called F4J, Fund for Jobs. F4J employs a director and a small management team. They go and contract with service providers, and they have a different contract with them. They agree what their budgets are, and they give them payments for inputs, outputs, and outcomes. The cash comes from these 4 social investors. As the service providers achieve their jobs and their performance managed and driven by that F4J team, as they achieve their jobs, F4J then claims those jobs back from the commissioner, in this case, Palestinian Authority or DAI, who manage it on their behalf. Next slide, please. Impact bonds are criticized as being complicated. Outcomes contracts are criticized for being complicated. These things are expensive to set up. Some of these impact bonds have taken years to set up, and they've spent millions doing so. Surely the quality will suffer, people say. If you push just for quantity of outcomes, then the quality of the service will be suffering. And providers don't like this model. Providers like to have their money up front. The next slide, please. I want to know what could be simpler than an outcomes contract. This is where we, as assuming we're the commissioning community, we're the people paying for this stuff, we're the public, or we're the Foreign Commonwealth Office, or USAID, or the World Bank. We need to decide what success looks like. Success is a better health service that delivers these 6 better impacts, these 6 better outcomes. Success is people finding jobs. Success is homeless people escaping the street and finding accommodation. Success is a child going back to school. Let's determine clear, simple, measurable definitions of success and attach our money to that. This ultimately is the Sheba test that we can apply to all of our development spending. Do we actually address the needs of Bernard and his dog Sheba, or do we address the needs of what our system thinks he needs? These have been expensive to set up, and they don't have to be. Look, there's template contracts for this now. We're paying for simple, measurable outcomes. We can cut through the noise and keep it clear and simple, but be careful. There are a number of management consultancies out there. There are a number of development organizations out there who will love to complicate this. That is their function in life, and that's what they get paid for. Procurement systems are complicated. They don't have to be. Keep it simple, and we can cut the cost and we can cut the time. Quality doesn't necessarily have to suffer. As I said in the employment program, if I'm going to achieve employment outcomes for someone with complex needs, I've got to engage with that person and deliver them a quality service. I've got to have a really good case manager in a nice office, highly motivated with good tools to engage with that person and give them the service that they need. Now, I've got to make sure that I design my contract to have a target group clearly delineated to ensure that I am pushing the service provider to deliver that quality in order to achieve that quantity. And I'm going to write some rules around it to make sure that they do deliver a service that is equitable, some minimum standards that they must adhere to. But quality and quantity will be 2 parts of the same thing. Do providers not like it? We ran an exercise, Shamsia referenced it earlier on, in which we asked providers in the mental health space, are you interested in delivering a contract and being paid for on the basis of outcomes? We received 51 responses, highly positive to this idea. Organizations wanting to deliver success for their service users and wanting to be empowered through the way they were contracted and through the way they were paid in order to do that. It's not a cure-all. There are bad outcomes contracts, just like there are bad fee-for-service contracts. But get it right, and it does have the potential to deliver so much more to so many more people in so many more contexts, including particularly difficult contexts, where the last thing is that we should be doing is sitting back in Washington or in Geneva or in London and deciding what the program should look like. We've got to create the conditions for that program to be designed locally, to be delivered locally, to be bottoms up in terms of starting with the individual service user and working with them upwards to achieve their outcome. That's the way that we achieve real impact. And that's the end of me this morning. Shamsi, I think we have time for questions. Can't hear you, Shamsi.
Classic. You think we'd get over that mistake now. Thank you so much, Richard. Fascinating. I've heard this a few times now, but I always learn something new in your presentation. I'm just looking through some comments. Many people thanking you, Richard. Linus, Jules, Tracy also said that she's really enjoying this session. And Sharon Siamba wrote, I think she was commenting when you were talking about impact bonds, that she agreed more of the concrete metrics than vanity metrics. But otherwise, I think we can open up to the floor, so to speak, and people can ask questions or make comments direct. So please do raise your hands, virtual hands, or just come off mute and speak. Deb, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Thank you again for that really thoughtful presentation. And this is more of me sort of, I guess, picking through definitions a little bit. So from an M&E perspective, a lot of sort of what you described seem to be more on the lines of outputs rather than outcomes per se, like, getting someone who's unhoused into a shelter, someone who's unemployed into gainful employment. But from an M&E perspective, I would be like, well, shouldn't the outcome be the quality of work, or how long they're able to stay in that job, or they're able to stay in a house without returning to the streets? So in a way, I mean, I wonder what would be your guidance on choosing some of these indicators, because there could be donors, there could be others who would say, you're not really choosing long-term outcomes, which are tied to sort of, I guess, the release of funds and whatnot, but you're actually choosing outputs over which you have more control, which are more of process indicators rather than some of these more long-term indicators, which truly speak to the impact of programs. So I was wondering what your thoughts would be on that. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Debji. Great question. So a couple of points there. First, a little bit of a challenge to the industry of monitoring and evaluation. So I've obviously worked with a lot of monitoring and evaluation colleagues in the Global Fund in particular and in the World Bank. And monitoring and evaluation tends to be an activity that is undertaken after a program has been delivered. So a program's been run, we're going to monitor and evaluate, we're going to write our evaluation report, we'll identify whether or not it has achieved the impacts it was supposed to achieve. In the performance management of an outcomes contract, and this should be true of any contract, but an outcomes contract incentivizes it. I want to take that monitoring and evaluation activity and embed it within delivery. It has got to be about continuous improvement. It's got to be about understanding what was delivered this month, what worked, what didn't work, and what needs to happen differently next month. And the second point I want to make is partly related to that, in that if that's the case, then what I'm monitoring and evaluating within my program delivery to drive my performance, to get as many people into jobs as I can, or as many people housed as I can, or as many people back to school as I can. If I'm going to do that, I've got to embed within there measures that are relevant to the operational delivery of the program. Now, as I say, you're going to see something quite different when Village Enterprise are talking, because they really were measuring and paid for a long-term impact. But generally within an employment program, and my apologies for keeping returning to that, but I think it's a strong example. If I want to measure long-term impact on employment rates or unemployment rates, it's disconnected from that day-to-day delivery. To drive that delivery, I've got to drive them towards an outcome that is relevant to them. And the outcome that is relevant to them is that individual starting a job. Now, I do want some quality measure around that job, so I'm going to do a number of things. One is I'll determine the fact that the job has got to have a certain number of hours and pay a certain rate and not be too far away from home and meet health and safety regulations and so on. The other thing I want to do is make sure that the job lasts. But for how long? If I want the job to last for 12 months, that's a very long time for the program to be tracking the individual, which is going to add cost. And actually, the individual might not want to be tracked for 12 months. And it starts to move over into this post hoc, this post-program monitoring and evaluation activity, rather than a delivery question. So how far is it relevant to push it out? Now I look at the evidence and I can see that actually, if someone stays in employment for 3 months, certainly for 6 months, then the chances of them staying in that employment for 12 months and longer are much increased. So let's attach the payment to that. It's close enough to the inputs and the outputs, but not so far away that it's distant, and distant as a performance driver and a culture driver within that service. And that, for me, in terms of trying to find my outcome, is what I'm looking for, that sweet spot where I'm pushing you to have a culture and a language and a focus on a meaningful outcome for the individual, what we're calling at HBGI, a functional outcome. That homeless person having a house, being housed, not in a shelter, but in independent housing of their own, being connected with people, place, and purpose in some way with functional outcomes that are meaningful for them, that is going to drive the service to achieve it. I can then do an impact evaluation alongside it, in which I will look at what is the actual return for investment of that homelessness service for the local government on impact on justice and health and schools and whatever. But in terms of the delivery and in terms of the design of the contract, that's how I'm going to be framing and looking for my outcomes. I hope that answers the question, Devjit. I need some tea.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Richard, for such a very rich presentation. Mine might not be a question, but I just want to give my experience, of incentivizing, or maybe give some incentives, particularly during carrying out projects. Like in my context, you find out, yes, this big organization, I think they made these smaller organizations suffer, because what they were doing is like they will give some incentives, when they're implementing the project, and now it gives a lot of dependency, syndrome amongst the clients, and definitely what's going to be the result is, if you want to give the quality service now, everyone is expecting, to be given something at the end of the day, especially particularly the clients. So now, it's now a very difficult environment, to provide service, because everyone is like, saying, what is that you're going, what is in this, what is in your project, you want to offer. For instance, maybe you say, no, let's promote the education aspect so that everyone are aware, and we know that everyone has got his own capacity, to deal with his own problems. And there's no necessary need for any incentive or any money or anything, for the betterment of their lives. But, they will say, no, this big donor, they come to us, they give us this, and, your project does not have anything, but what's more can get from the education aspect. So you see, those are some of the critical, things that we get from, advising. Also, I really want to agree with you to say, yes, as much as we are providing a service, there are some services that definitely we need to fire at some point during implementation. If we see these services are not, bearing any results, as per our planning or as per our expectation. So definitely we need to fire those services and bring other, services that, change or transform people's lives. So yes, Richard, I agree with you in some of your presentation, and also sharing my experience. Over to you, Richard.
Linos, thank you very much. You describe a really difficult problem sort of at the heart of international development in the way that a dependency culture is developed, isn't it? In that, and we see this, it's particularly acute in somewhere like Afghanistan where I worked, where the only money in the system really was development money for many years. And there becomes this huge dependency on it. But that dependency surely is increased through the poor grant management, the poor contracting behavior of those donors. Because the donor decides, oh, this is what you're going to deliver. This is the service you're going to deliver. I know what is best. This is what you'll be delivering. And now I'm going to pay you to do it. So I want you to employ some staff. I want you to open offices, and I'm going to pay for those things. Rather than coming in and going, well, what we're actually looking for are these social outcomes for these individuals. And that is what I want to be paying for. I'm not simply giving money to you as an organization to be dependent upon. I'm wanting to come into this environment and pay for social outcomes for the people living in this context. Potentially, that can shift some of that dependency culture. And it also is the only way that we're going to be able to move towards the independence of governments locally then paying for these services. So we had this conversation a lot at the Global Fund about transition countries. So a transition country is a country where they're moving away from a Global Fund grant to paying for it for themselves, ideally. Typically, it will be an HIV-related service. And some of the people running these transition countries would come to us and say, how can we contract for these programs when the Global Fund grant ends? How can we persuade the government to pay for it? Now, there's no simple answer to this. This is, it's as complicated, and these governments have so many demands on their budgets. But they're only really surely going to pay for something if they know what it is they're paying for, if they can see the results of that program, if they can see the impact of that program. So when we contract an HIV-related service, we need to demonstrate to them how much it actually costs to engage with these people and the results we achieve in terms of people sustaining their HIV treatment, people being tested for HIV, and so on, whatever the success measures are, so that then the government can look at it and go, okay, I understand, $1,000 pays for this, X, Y, or Z, rather than 10 million pays for these service providers to do whatever it is that they do, and I can't actually see it. I hope that answer was sort of clear, Linos, but it's an interesting point you raise, and there certainly is no simple answer to it. Shamsia, should we, unless you've got any more questions in the chat, should we move on to Village Enterprise?
There is one more question from Barry Grimes on the chat, and I'll read it out, but Barry, please feel free to speak up. So Barry was really asking about paying the outcome being the cause. So how do you establish a causal relationship between the service provider and the outcome without you might?
That's not the question, Shabby. Sorry. It's how do you establish a causal relationship between the service provided and the outcome? How can we establish? How can we establish that what the service provider is doing is actually achieving the outcome that we're looking for? And this is one of the criticisms that is sometimes raised against an outcomes contract. So Barry, it's an interesting question, and to an extent, I'm afraid I find it a philosophical question that doesn't necessarily have a huge amount of concrete application for me as a practitioner. If we go back, as I will, to the employment and the training example. So how can I be sure that this service provider who goes into this unemployed population and achieves employment outcomes, that their interventions are what is actually achieving those outcomes? Compare that, if you will, with another contract in which I go to a service provider and I say, well, I've decided that actually all of them need to learn woodworking. I'm going to pay you to run a woodworking program for 1,000 people, and I will pay you for that delivery. End of story. In which of these cases is it more likely that the intervention is going to be linked to those outcomes? In the one in which the service provider is paid for each of those outcomes, or the one in which the service provider is paid purely for the inputs? And the payment for those inputs and the payments for those training programs is the common model across the world, funded by virtually everybody, not that outcome model. But it's only in that outcome model, surely, where we drive causality into the service delivery itself. On these impact bonds that I have chaired, I've chaired 10 of them to date. Every month we have a performance review. And on the outcomes funds that HBGI hopes to establish, we'll contract service providers, we'll pay them on the basis of the outcomes they deliver, and every month we'll have a performance review. And in that performance review, we will be looking at what they have delivered in the previous month. Who did they engage with? What activities did they deliver to them? Who didn't they speak to? Why didn't they speak to those people? Everything that went on in that previous month, and how it was leading towards the achievement of outcomes for the service users, in order to determine what they should do differently the following month in order to achieve more of those outcomes. Causality, if we want to use that word, or not causality, it's simply performance management for me becomes embedded within the culture of the delivery, because we're constantly asking, is this taking us where we want to go? And where we want to go is that outcome. It's not the completion of the training program, whatever that might be. DLIs, the disbursement linked indicators, Debjit, work a little bit like that, but they're a little bit disconnected, I find, in that in the way that the World Bank generally apply them, And this is a part of results-based financing for the World Bank, which they do across 25% of their spend. They use something called disperse-linked indicators, where they will agree with the ministry certain indicators that that ministry must achieve in order for the money to be dispersed to them. But those indicators for that Ministry of Economy are somewhat disconnected from the service delivery that the Department for Health has to deliver out in the rural province. And the number of frontline staff that have to be employed there and the number of cesarean deliveries that have to be undertaken there is a long way away from the disperse-linked indicator, which said the Ministry of Economy is going to purchase 10 new computers. So there is quite a disconnect. Shamsia, you know, I could go on all day, but I do think people would love to hear from Village Enterprise.
Absolutely. Great. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you so much, everybody. Yeah, thanks everybody for listening. Thank you, Shamsia.
You're not going, Richard. You're staying on board. Brilliant. I'll hand over to Village Enterprise colleagues. Tadeo in particular. Tadeo, please do yourself justice in terms of introducing yourself. And if you have any comments to add to Richard's presentation, you're very welcome to.
All right. Thank you so much, Shamsia. Really excited to be here. I feel like this was, although Richard said he's not an academician, I felt like I was in a lecture room. Really, I've learned a lot and it's quite enlightening. And I can just even feel the enthusiasm from him. And it's so nice to just have somebody who's so passionate and who believes that, because we really do need more champions to propel this new sort of thinking. Although it's not new, but we need more people on board. As Shamsia has earlier introduced me, I am Tadeo Muriuki, currently serving as a Chief Government Relations Officer. But prior to that, I also worked as a Kenya Country Director, and I was involved as a project manager for the development impact bond here in East Africa. And I'm also joined by my colleagues, with Celeste Brubaker, who's a Chief Impact Officer, and she was really instrumental in terms of, say, end-to-end, from the design to, to the results. She was really instrumental in that. So she's, I think, our version of Richard in terms of also her passion for outcome-based funding. And then I've also seen a few of my colleagues here. I'm glad that you're joining. I've seen Liz, Eva, Billy. So glad to be all of us part of this really enlightening discussion. So I'll just spend a few minutes just talking about our development impact bond, and then I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'll have also either Celeste and other people also be willing to be doing if those questions would be more pertinent for them to be able to respond to. So Shamsia, could you please move to the next slide? Thank you. So as Village Enterprise, our vision is an African continent free of extreme poverty. As you know, the Sustainable Development Goal 1 is really to end poverty. So that is what really we work on. That's our bread and butter. And as we tell people, we put blinders as a non-profit, as a development organization, and that's all we do. We don't, you find a lot of other organizations doing a lot of other issues, but we only focus on one, and it's just about ending extreme poverty. Next slide, please. Yes, so our model is what we call an ultra-poor graduation model. So graduation models, as some of you may know, was pioneered several years ago by BRAC, but we've also been in this space for quite a bit, for about 20 years now, and we have been able to come up with a model that really has been very successful, especially in the context that we work in. So we have a model that we know poverty is a complex problem. It's not one that can be solved by a single bullet. So we know it is a place where there are multiple poverty traps, and thinking about how do we come up with a comprehensive or a multidimensional way of be able to eradicate extreme poverty. So we do this using what we call our 12-month or a 1-year graduation model, where we take our participants through a time-bound, sequenced set of interventions. And as you can see from the slide there, we do targeting where we make sure we enroll people who are living below extreme poverty. We bring them into a group which we call a business savings group. It's usually a group about 25 to 30 people. Then we offer them financial and literacy, financial training and business literacy, helping them be about more financial literate and also being able to start and run a successful business. Then we also offer a cash transfer. It's usually we call it a seed capital. It's a grant where we don't require people to pay back. And then once we do that, we have our participants usually in a group of 3, and depending on which program we're working in, or sometimes a single households where they start their enterprises. And then what we really do, we take our time is really to offer what we call mentoring. So we have mentors in their communities. They come from those communities. They are well trained. We offer them continuous training, and they're able to really support our entrepreneurs to be able to have successful businesses. Then we also offer market linkages, helping them grow so that they're able to not only be able to offer their products within a small ecosystem, but really connecting them to different places. And then after what we consider graduation is after our participants have passed through these the sequence set of interventions and being able to have actively participated, then we do consider them to be graduated into what we call sustainable livelihoods and resilience. So just to give you an example of, just to picture somebody who we work with, think about a woman who in rural Uganda, very disconnected from markets, has a large family, find their widows, not able to feed her family, maybe even sometimes the kids going hungry for 1 or 2 days, no source of food, leaking roof, probably sometimes even sleeping outside because they don't have a sound structure, and they have no source of income, and the kids are not able to go to school. They're not able to, in case there's a shock, like somebody getting sick, not able to afford medical care. So those are usually the kind of people we work with, and mostly we work with women, and really helping them to be able to get that, the ability to earn an income, the ability, I think this is one of the most important things that we've seen, the ability to have confidence that they can do things for themselves, the agency, the ability to even speak up. And that's why you see them even like in service groups, taking part in leaderships and all that, so that they are able to really believe in themselves, able to, when they're out there interacting with customers, they're able to really run successful enterprises. Some shares, next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm really let me talk about the Village Enterprise Development Impact Bond. So this was conceptualized around 2017. It was, I would say, because I was still there when this idea was birthed. It was one of those ideas where I think, do we really want to get into this? No one else in the poverty alleviation space had ever tried this. And I know a few people had been approached, and they were like, no, we're not gonna, we don't think we'll be able to pull this off. But when we looked at our data, both internally and also the RCTs, we were very confident that this is something that a project or a model that would be able to take part in and be able to come out with positive results. So next slide, please. So as you can see, this was it was the first development impact bond, again, designed for poverty alleviation in Africa. The idea was to work with over 95,000 individuals. We committed around about $5 million. And then the whole intention of this project, as I think, just going back to what Richard was saying, it was not to be paid for our intention to improve lives, but rather for the success to improve those lives by increasing household income and assets, and being verified by an independent entity. So it was really the success of it rather than the intention of it. And I think that's what really transformative about outcome-based funding. So our funders, our outcome funders, we had USAID, we had then, which was called DFID, but now it was renamed to FCDO. We had a private anonymous donor, and who agreed that for every dollar that we were able to participate, to increase participants' income, they would pay that for us. So that was really the model. And then also our success was going to be validated by an independent entity, ID Insight. I think it's a well-known research firm that carried out a randomized control trial. Next slide, please. Yes, and as you see here, it's, I think there were also these discussions, also Richard's presentation in terms of the complexity of outcome-based funding. So this one was no exception, and it was quite a, what we call a unique and complex structure. And here, this was because Village Enterprise was responsible for raising the working capital. We were also responsible for contracting with our pre-financiers who were providing the capital. And so that was what really made it complex. But I've been informed that there will be another session taking a deep dive into these. So probably we'll not spend a lot of time on that, and we'll do that next time. Somsha, next slide, please. So in terms of the implementation, we started this in January 2018. This was after the design, and after all the contracts have been signed and all the agreements have been made. And then it ran through December 2020. And as most of you know, what happened during the year of 2020. So it was about 7 cohorts. And this with the headline data collection taking place in May to August 2021. So as you can see, they started in January 2020. The first cohort that graduated was the data collection took place 2.5 years after it had already graduated. The data collection took place after 2.5 years after data collection and before data collection, and then the last cohort was 6 months before data collection. And that we emphasize that because it really, one of the things we wanted to look at was the sustainability, because people do question does impact decrease over time and all that. So we did have obviously several cohorts where we were able to look at the sustained impact way after the households had graduated out of our program. Next slide, please. Yes, as I mentioned, this was done through a randomized controlled trial. And the question we were asking, of the evaluation question, was, what was the impact of the Village Enterprise Program on household economic welfare relative to control households? So we had obviously the treatment households and the control households. We had about 500 households, and evenly split between treatment and control treatment households, and sorry, we had 500 villages. I'm sorry, we had 500 villages and split between 200 evenly split between treatment and control. And the research question was really looking at the consumption and assets of all the households. So the households took part in our program being compared to those that were in the control, and then using that difference, and the difference was going to be attributed to our program. So that's, that's I think the usual straightforward way of an RCT. So looking at this, next slide. How did we perform? We were, to say the least, quite elated by the results of our RCT. We had been, candidly been walking on eggshells, because that's the time also, COVID had hit. A lot of entrepreneurs had been really affected by COVID. So we were really not sure whether we were going to have any positive results, primarily because of the pandemic. But we were really, we were pleasantly surprised to see, such kind of significant results, and showing also sustained increases in terms of household spending and net worth despite the pandemic. As you can see also here from this slide, you'll see that the lifetime gain income participants was actually 4 times greater than what it consisted, what we spent across the entire project. And then as you see, the lifetime benefits in terms of 5 times greater than the village enterprise implementation cost. So really trying to see that, this project was really value for money, that we, our beneficiaries, which is what is really important, that there's 4 more times or 5 times impact based on in terms of how much we had put in there. So in terms of the full, including all the other intermediaries under our program, that was 4 times, and just for village enterprise, it was only village implementing, that was 5 times. So really, I would say value for money in terms of the project. So for every $1 that we invested in implementing the program, $5 of impact was generated. And that was really very elating for us. So, thinking about Agnes, who I earlier mentioned, she was one of our participants in this project. Now, based on this, given all the interventions, how we, the program supported her, she was able to start her own business. She started a bread making business. She diversified, started doing groundnuts, farming, and also rearing livestock. She was able to send her kids to school. She was able to sleep in a house with no leaking roof. And that's what really we are looking for. That's the sort of impact we are really looking for. And that's what we really want at the end of the day in terms of looking for successful models that are able to generate these positive impacts to our participants, especially to the people who are living in extreme poverty. Next slide, please. So what is in terms of the impact in terms of looking at our organization? I have to say this was for us a game changer. I mean, I was there when it started and all the way to the end, and I can tell you the people who, especially our frontline workers who took part in DIB, things really changed. First of all, the ability to even just have people are able to come up with their own innovations, be having like that, the incentives or just their motivation to really try and test out new ideas. And I think I said this is really different from, other, like grants where sometimes you have to do a lot of, if you have to do some changes from the original design, sometimes you have to reach out to the funder and you have to ask for approval and all that. But with this development impact bond, you don't have to do that, because at the end of the day, what is going to be looked at are the outcome and not really the process. So having that mindset where our frontline workers were able to innovate and able to do things really without looking over their shoulders, I found that to be really transformational. The other thing is that, for a long time, we had talked about developing adaptive management systems where each of our frontline workers will be able to access and be able to see what kind of, the success of the entrepreneurs or any data related maybe to like the savings in terms of their, in terms of their businesses, how they were doing. And so we were able to even have that. And we came up with a very, I would say, powerful performance adaptive management system where everybody had access. So any of our mentors in the development board would just be able to click and be able to see all of their participants under them, how they were faring. And that was so successful that we ended up actually scaling out and scaling it to all our everybody, all the other teams that also are not taking part in the development impact bond, and we just thought that to be very transformational. We also ended up doing other pilots, other innovations. Sorry, as we mentioned, part of the pilot, it took part during pandemic, and prior to that, we were doing what we call cash disbursements, but we ended up now coming up with systems where we are able to roll out our grants through a digital means, so we don't have to be sending people to meet with the entrepreneurs face to face, and it has become also very successful and rolled out to all our programming, to all our staff and all our areas. We also able to update our training and mentoring curriculums, and people ask us, yeah, you could do that all without an impact bond. And again, I remember I used to say, why don't we do this? Why don't we do this? But I think the impact bond was really a catalyst. It was like, say that we have to do these things for us to be successful. So because, and it really was able to, for us to be able to say, yeah, let's do this, let's take this risk, try all these things. Because at the end of the day, what we really wanted to do is to have the maximum success for our entrepreneurs, and who are willing to take those risks, who are willing to try new innovations, and even be willing to fail so that we can know what works and what doesn't work, and not worrying what the donor will think about, because at the end of the day, we were just really focused on the success of our entrepreneurs. Given that they were also the first organization to be in this space in terms of poverty alleviation, so we've been able to get the visibility. We're able to speak different places and just give our perspective on this, and really having other people learn from what we've been doing, and thinking if that's something that they would want also to be able to take part in. Next slide, please, Shamsia. Key learnings. So everything is, we had, great learnings, the positives. One of the things I keep on mentioning is that the innovations, where we're able to do things well. And it has really, I would say, that culture of innovation has continued. I think it's ingrained, where we're willing to take this risk. We are not afraid of failure. And I think that's really something that has continued as an organization. So that's been very, positive for us. The results can prove that, the outcomes, that the model works, and it's something that we're able to, we think we ought to be continuing, and all that. It also contributed to have, all the stakeholders being aligned, and, all of us being on the same page. Some of that, I would say, challenges, or some things that we learned along the way, was that governance, the structures were quite complex. So we had all these different, parties, intermediaries. We had an external project manager. We had a trustee. We had all these people, and it took us, I think, a lot of our time, and also resources, I would say, to be able to have, to be able to get all these people on the one page and all that. So really, I would say that was also maybe a challenge. And also, RCT, this was a randomized control trial. RCTs are not cheap. So, that also was, I'd say, an added cost, especially given that, graduation, RCTs we have several RCTs about graduation, and I think there's abundant evidence that it works. So I'd say that maybe that's something we may want to think about as we go forward, whether we do, if there's value in terms of having another RCT. Next slide, please. And I just realized the person who's managing the slides is not Shamsia, so I'm sorry for that. Future outcome-based contracts. So what are we thinking about in terms of this? So this was a pilot, as we said, we had like very positive learning. We also had some learnings that we want to factor in as we think about the next steps. So that's So these are some of the things we would want to think about. So let's think. So one of the things, I think one of our learning, what we would want to recommend is that we still need more evidence. There's more evidence in terms of the cost effectiveness of outcomes-based funding. I think in terms of all what we talked about, we had a lot of stakeholders, we had all in terms of making sure the contracting process, the due diligence, that does add up to all these transaction costs. So we really need to think about how can we come up maybe with a more cost-effective. So thinking about can we do further evidence of that, and how can we simplify this structure? I would say another thing we want to do, as Richard is passionately doing, is increase advocacy and adoption of results-based funding, both by funders and also where we're implementing. I think there's still a lot of reluctance. I think change takes time. People, especially when you do something that's been done for a long time, people are a bit averse in terms of change. So I think we really want to continue advocating that. In terms of, simplifying it, we think that we could be able to limit the role of some of the intermediary roles in terms of the people like the trustee, we had all these parties, and we think that's something that in our next, if we were to do this in our next iteration, we could be able to limit or actually eliminate them if possible. So next slide, please. So thinking about, again, how do we make this a bit more simpler? I think Richard did talk about, people do have, feedback or comments that, sometimes outcome-based funding can be really complex and all that. Again, we did use an RCT. We were using household income, wealth, and well-being as our outcomes. But again, when there's abundance of evidence that the model does produce those positive impacts. And what we've seen using our own internal analysis, using external RCTs, is that if you launch successful businesses, then there's a positive correlation in terms of successful outcomes. So, you're able to have increased household income, wealth, and well-being. So thinking about how do we be able to simplify that. So we really want to advocate in terms of, as we move forward, that we that instead of being based on outcomes, we can be based on results in terms of business success, because that still has been validated that business success does translate into positive outcomes of increased household income, wealth, and well-being. So let's see the next slide in terms of what we are talking about here. So you see, this is from the analysis in terms from ID Insight, where there's a positive correlation. So you'll note that those businesses that were doing well, so but it's not color-coded here, the green businesses, they also there's a positive correlation in terms of, you look at the green businesses on the left, there's also positive correlation that they had higher net assets. So we are really convinced that having that as, using business success as a metric is much easier one, and actually you're able to also get the data much sooner, and especially if you have to use that as a metric of getting paid and all that, then we're able to do that instead of waiting 3 years later until an RCT is done or an evaluation is done. We can be able to use that money to be able to recycle and continue with an impact or outcome-based funding. Next slide, please. So I know this proposed program to work for Village Enterprise in terms of the next proposal. So what we're trying again to advocate and to propose or recommend is that payments be based on business outcomes, and then adding a few metrics such as individual level psychological and well-being outcomes. And this has come from other RCTs where we've seen the positive correlation in terms of participants who take part in a graduation and ending up doing well in terms of psychosocial well-being, in mental health, what we were just talking about, and also well-being. Yeah, I think that's it for me. Next slide, I think it's about question and answers. And yep, thank you.
Daya, thank you for a really fascinating conversation there, a really fascinating presentation there. I particularly found it really interesting to contrast sort of the village enterprise model with what we talked about earlier, what Richard had presented on in terms of the results chain, and how further along the line the village enterprise model is in terms of measuring impact as opposed to sort of measuring outcome, and then kind of the sort of the differences associated with that. So you were being paid on sort of the changes that you're bringing about in terms of a group, the villages, whereas an outcomes-based contract, you're paying for the sort of impact on that individual level. And then kind of also seeing the sort of the difference between sort of embedded real-time performance data on outcomes-based contracts as opposed to kind of the RCT evaluation. So really, really fascinating. And then to see how that model could be shifted when you focus on outcomes as opposed to impact. So really fascinating. Thank you. As you were talking today, there was a number of comments on on the chat. So I might actually open up to the floor initially to see if anybody had any further comments or questions for Tadeo or Celeste. If not, I may invite some of the colleagues who've written on the chat group to kind of expand a little bit more on what they've said. Great. Just so, Linos, over to you. If you come off mute.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation. I think I managed to grasp a lot of some very good, ideas. And I just want to know the type of the clientele, that you are working with. And I believe in any programming, there are, of course, failures and success. So maybe I may want also to understand, from, I know that the strength is on training, mentorship, so I may want also to understand after, those that have been trained, how successful, of course, there's some dropouts, or how does the program, going or sustained, particularly with some of the clients. I think.
Thank you, Linos. So just to give you, I think what I mentioned earlier. So mostly we work with mostly women, although it's not exclusively women. Again, we work with people who are living in extreme poverty, and then we work only in the rural communities in East Africa. So for the Development Impact Bond, we worked in northwestern Kenya, and then in eastern Uganda, in rural eastern Uganda. So we work with women, rural women, a lot of them who are living in rural communities in subsistence farming or doing casual labor, or maybe mostly probably not having really any source of income, or very irregular source of income. In terms of what we look at in terms of the success, or what you look, it's really about businesses. So we really support them to start businesses, and they have different sort of businesses. We have significant number of them by the nature of being in rural communities who are in agriculture. So they engage in growing short-term crops and then selling them at the market. We have people who do like poultry rearing. We do have people who are in retail, they have small shops, so they set up small shops. They have people who have in skilled businesses. We really give people their agency to start the businesses that they feel passionate about or they're interested about. But then for us on our end is to mentor them to be successful. Then the other thing we really support, and we call it an exit strategies or savings group. So right from the onset, they get onto a savings group about 25 to 30 people. We help them come up with a constitution. We support them in terms of they elect their own leaders. We really encouraging women to be the leaders, and then really having them to be on a path of financial inclusion. So a lot of them have zero, never had a bank account. A lot of them are very paranoid about even borrowing loans. So really, first of all, helping them to be able to save. And the idea is for them to start saving on a very minuscule basis, but as the business grows, then they're able to put more money into the savings, and then using that money, the savings, to be able to borrow from the savings, and really encouraging them to borrow from the savings to be able to expand their business, or maybe for other purposes. We have one very popular program where we call it Saving the Purpose, where they're able to save for their household assets. You find people like Agnes saving to buy roofing materials, the corrugated iron sheet. You see other people, saving to buy even cooking pots, just very small things that for us, we think it's very cheap, but for them, that's really monumental because they've never been able to have access to that. I think, I don't know if I'm able to answer your question in terms of that. And then you can always find more information. Please go to our website. We have very riveting stories of the people who we work with, and you'll be able to see some of more stories about that.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think you're doing a very good job, from the explanation. But of course, if we are looking into our African context, I think we need also to make sure that we put these women in the so that they're able to create wealth, for themselves. And I understand that most of the wealth in the African context is attached to different, ministries. I think as an organization, it's also very important then to attach them, like forming cooperatives, for instance, starting like, creating their own, for instance, the tourism industry. So they have like, some hotels within certain communities. I think just to put them in the wealth mainstream, which is attached to our government. I don't know how much that can be possible, but I think we need also to think along that direction, or so that they're also mainstreamed in the wealth, for them to benefit the next generations, I think.
Yes, I agree. So as we started out, we graduation, we talk about it being sort of like a push and pull, in terms of, we're pushing them out of extreme poverty, but then what we also want to do is pulling them into market systems. And we actually there's a interesting pilot, although right now it's focused on refugees, where we have a graduation plus, where we have graduation plus market systems. And that's, I think, what you're talking about, where once they go through our program, we're also integrating them with market systems. So how they're able to, connected with private sector actors, how we able to bring maybe even incorporating them to value chains, in terms of even thinking about financial inclusion and all that. So we are really working on that. And again, I'm happy to share with you any information, but a lot of it you can also find it on our website.
Great, thank you. So today there is Francis asks a question about how village enterprises are leveraging existing government programs such as Operation Wealth Creation and now the parish development model.
Yeah, I have to say I don't know much about Operation Wealth Creation, but let me say, given that I live in Kenya, so maybe what I've said is in Kenya we have tried to try work closely with what you call county government, and I think in Uganda that would be more like the parish development model. But this is work in progress. So in Kenya, one of the things we've done is given an example of what here in West Pokot, we are supporting the county government coming up with a policy of a graduation policy where they're able to come up with a policy that they're able to set aside funding so that they can be able to resource in terms of supporting their women in the county, start enterprises, being able to go through the sequence set of interventions, and being able to graduate. We're also working with them in terms of gender empowerment. We're trying to work with them also in terms of climate smart agriculture. And for me, my hope, and as I told you again, my role is Chief Government Relations Officer, and we're trying to see how do we work closely with governments in terms of scaling up or adoption of graduation. And I hope that at some point, and it's something that we've actually tried and we're trying to work, Celeste is also taking the lead in this, in terms of helping governments use an outcome-based lens. It's a long game, right? It takes time for some of these things, but it's something that we are really intentional. And I think for us, the path to scale, and also the path to ensuring that the outcomes are being achieved is really using these innovative models, but also working with government to be able to reach a lot more people.
Great. Fantastic. Tadeo, thank you so much. I don't think there are any questions or comments. I'll give it a couple more seconds in case anybody else has anything else. Brilliant. Okay. Well, in which case, we'll conclude, and I will thank you all for joining us today. And a particularly warm thanks to Richard and Tadeo for two very fascinating presentations. Lots of learning for all of us, I think, whether we've been involved in outcomes contracting or not. So thank you both. And an extension of that warm thanks to all the team at Village Enterprise today for making this happen with us. As I said earlier at the start of the session, we will make the recording available. We've got another session in a couple of hours, and then we'll put the recording up. We will be circulating the information for the next capacity building workshop in due course. It will be on effective performance management, on outcome-based contracting, and it will take place in early July. So please do look out for it. We'll put it up on our website and our social media platform, and we will of course email you about it. In the meantime, if you have any further questions or comments, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us, or any suggestions for future events. But otherwise, warm thank you to you all. Have a good rest of the day or rest of the evening, and see some of you back in a few hours.
Thank you for having
Roxanne,
us. Really appreciate that.
It's been a pleasure today. We'll see. Well, I think we'll see Celeste in a few hours. Thank you for this morning. Bye all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, everyone, thanks again.